welcome to the book show. So who are you going to be talking to this week, Graham?
Well, later on this evening, talking to Paul Thomas, the outstanding New Zealand crime fiction writer.
Right, and we've got some children coming on the show this week as well. The wonderful Paula Green, who writes children's poetry, will be here with some children and some poetry for us. But what's caught your eye this week? I'm aware that a whole lot of new stock has come into the bookshops, October releases. Two of them have caught your attention, obviously, Graham.
Yes, two for review. The first one, My Story, by Julia Gillard, the former Australian Prime Minister, of course. Great big 500-page autobiography, which I'm really looking forward to reading. And I just quickly looked in the index and I see there are quite a few references to New Zealand there, so see what she's got to say. And the other one is Stephen Fry's More For Me, a memoir. This is the third one that he's done in this series.
You know what strikes me, Graham, that we've got two autobiographies, both hardbacks, both with white covers, both with the photograph of the person on the front. Very similar.
That's true, yes. I think they're especially famous people. That's probably got something to do with it.
But they're published in different parts of the world, aren't they?
This one's an Australian book, My Story, and this one's come out of the UK.
Right.
This one's especially interesting because he's doing a launch of it via the cinemas worldwide. So it's going to be released in every major centre in the world at the same time. He's going to give a 1-hour stand-up launch of the book. So that's
fantastic. It's a bit like NT Live, the theatre performances from the National Theatre in London that they broadcast worldwide.
Yes, quite.
Fascinating. Yes. Well, I've particularly noticed the Hilary Mantel, of course, famous Hilary Mantel, winning the Booker twice with I keep getting confused. Bring Up the Bodies is the second one. Wolf Hall's the first one. Bring Up the Bodies is the second one. And she's writing the third one, but in between time she's released this book of short stories. And the title story, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher, has caused quite a stir in the UK.
It has. I mean, it's even gone to Parliament. There have been several hours debate about this. The Conservative members of Parliament are very upset about the title of that story.
Right. Well, that should be very good for sales, shouldn't it? It'll give it lots of publicity.
Free publicity for the book.
Yeah, indeed. I've also noticed this new one, The Underground Girls of Kabul. Jenny Nordberg is the author. It's the hidden lives of Afghan girls disguised as boys. Now, I haven't had time to read this yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I think for some families it's become a reality that if they have no man in the household, the women are not allowed to go out without a man, and so they can't even go and buy food. So they've resorted to dressing some of their girls as boys so they can go out in the world. So that's a fascinating read, I'm sure. And I have read and loved Lawrence Fearnley's new novel, which has just arrived, Reach, by the wonderful Lawrence Fearnley, who lives in the South Island, and she's a very special writer. Her writing is gentle and evocative. She creates a feeling about the South Island beautifully. This one's set on the coast, as you can see from this wonderful watery cover. A deep sea diver is one of the main characters, but also a woman artist who is a very talented but quite obsessive woman artist, and it's fascinating. So, new novel from the wonderful Lawrence Fearnley.
Oh, look forward to that.
I think that there'll be a lot more new books coming in at the beginning of November and again at the beginning of December for Christmas. So exciting new stuff being published. So Paula Green, welcome to the book show.
Thank you.
Now you're an established poet in your own right and you're now working with children, but let's just talk about your own poetry for a moment first. What are the two most recent volumes of your own work that have been published?
Well, in terms of my own poetry for adults, Slipstream, which came out of my breast cancer experience, and The Baker's Thumbprint, which was published by Seraph Press. So those are my two recent things. But I've also been doing anthologies like the Dear Heart Love Poems.
That was the wonderful collection where you gathered all these love poems from New Zealand poets. Yes,
yeah, I love doing that. And then the huge book I wrote with Harry Rickett's 99 Ways into New Zealand Poetry. So kind of sidetracking into all areas, but really just carrying on with that love of poetry I have, particularly in terms of the musicality of poetry and the surprise of poetry.
So the sound.
The sound,
the sound of it.
Absolutely.
And presumably it's also the sound of it that the children love.
It is, it's the number one thing. And if you think back to when you're a child with the lullabies and the stories being told to you, the sound just catches your attention, it hooks the child's ear, and that's really important to me.
And you run a thing called Poetry Box. Tell us about that.
Well, about 2 years ago I decided that I don't know why, I wanted to become an unofficial ambassador for poetry for and by children. And I just thought, I want to do this in every way possible. Whatever pops into my head, I want to make it happen. So the first thing I did was I started this blog for children called Poetry Box, and on it, it's just growing and growing, and on it I post tips and challenges and competitions and lots of poems by children and by adults and book reviews. And I've ended up creating a poetry network throughout the whole country where I interact with children in classes and schools and families and parents. So yeah, quite wonderful.
Very exciting. And one of the, well, there's lots of outcomes from it, but one of them is the Letterbox Cat and other poems that you have published, and we're going to have some children reading some of the poems. I think we've got Neo and Amy, and they're each going to read, or they're going to actually recite. They've learnt them by heart, haven't they?
Yeah.
They're going to each recite a poem, from the Letterbox Cat, and then together they will read a joint poem together, which will be quite lovely. Very exciting, and I think that will show just how much the kids really love poetry.
I think I do. I feel that, you know, I visit schools a lot and I do events a lot, and for me, I love working with sophisticated writers, but for me, when I go into a school, my aim is to just hook the whole range of children, the reluctant writer, right through up to the child that's passionate about writing and reading. And for me, poetry is a way of liberating the child, of hooking their imagination and getting them on that wonderful adventure of words and books and writing.
The Letterbox Cat. Our cat climbs on the top of the letterbox as if she's waiting for a letter from London or Luxembourg or Leuven or Sydney or Samoa or Berlin. But all we get is paper for our recycling bin.
A book cat. A bookworm gobbles her way through books for breakfast, lunch and dinner. But I am a book cat. I like to go hunting in the mysterious night and the shining day of pages. I like to shut myself away in a book like it's my warm and cozy cat basket.
Shoes. Boat shoes.
Car shoes.
Bike shoes.
Goat shoes.
Giraffe shoes.
Kite shoes.
Soap shoes.
Fluffy shoes.
Light shoes.
Rope shoes.
Tough shoes.
My shoes.
Fantastic. And then about to arrive in the New Zealand bookshops, I think in about a week's time, in fact less than a week, a few days, is this gorgeous treasury of New Zealand poems for children. It's absolutely beautiful.
I know.
It's exquisite.
When I received my advance copy, I was just full of delight. Like, it's got gorgeous ribbons, it's got a beautiful dust jacket, and utterly wonderful illustrations by Jenny Cooper. And I feel like her illustrations are like a chocolate box. They're not all the same. They're full of life, but they shift in style. They're so animated. They're full of heart. And they're like little poems on the page. So I love that about it. But it was like Dear Heart, when Random House commissioned me to do it. It was an instant yes. And first of all, thanks to the Super City, I went on the great adventure of interloaning every possible children's poetry book published in New Zealand. And so, you know, I got treasures like Joy Cowley's Paw Prints on the Butter, illustrated by children, a gorgeous book. I never knew it existed because it's out of print. So many of these books out of print. So I found all kinds of gold nuggets. And then I went with my daughter to the library at the College of Education, and we went through every school journal, and that was another wonderful adventure.
It must have been a huge
task.
task.
It was huge. And so, you know, again, like finding wonderful poems by James K. Baxter or Margaret Mahy, Joy Cowley, Peter Bland, you know, any number of writers, Fiona Farrell, and then finding writers that I never heard of and just think, wow, I found some poems, some books by this woman called Shirley Gayworth, who lives in Nelson. She's 95, and she's been writing poetry all her life, had published a number of children's poetry books, and when I phoned her up to say, look, you know, your poems are going to be in the book, 'cause it was very hard to trace her to get permission, she said to me, finally, recognition. And
at the age of 95.
Yeah. And I love her poems, and I just think, you know, this is such a treat to have her in there.
And they're in here.
They're in there. And then, you know, so I had all these poems specifically written for children, which is how I write. When I write a poem for a child. Those children are in my study with me when I write, and I want to hook their attention. But there are a number of poets that don't write for children, like Bill Manhire, Jenny Bornholdt, who I think have that kind of magical touch with sound and imaginative leaps that are going to get that child's attention. So it's a real mix of poetry, kind of, yeah.
Fascinating. Now, finally, just tell us about this amazing tour that you're doing. The Spot, what have you called it?
The Poetry Hotspot Tour.
Poetry
I
Hotspot Tour.
Can I just say one more thing about this? It's also got 20 poems by children, because I did a competition on Poetry Box, and I love that there are poems by children in here too.
So there's never been quite a collection like this published in New Zealand before?
No, I don't think so. Not with this scope, yeah.
Gorgeous.
And the quality of production from Random House.
Yes, gorgeous. So tell us about the tour.
Hotspot Poetry Tour. I decided this was like a culmination of my blog and these 2 books and everything I'm doing for children's poetry in New Zealand. So I decided to tour the country, and thanks to Creative New Zealand and Random House and the National Library and the New Zealand Book Council, I've made it happen. So I'm going to places like Te Papa, Pukeariki in New Plymouth, the Canterbury Museum, but like in Canterbury at the museum, it is so over capacity. The audience has just exploded, so now we have to find a new venue.
A bigger venue.
And
Wonderful.
so I'm now looking at a school hall, which I'm kind of finalising today. So we're having to shift premises out of the bird section, which is kind of it's a pity, but it's also recognising, the love of poetry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So all over New Zealand.
Yeah, so I'm going to Gisborne, New Plymouth, Wellington, Nelson, Dunedin, Christchurch, Queensland, Arrowtown.
And this starts
Tauranga.
when? It starts
on the first day of term 4. So it's a whole month. And
So
everywhere I go, I'm involving local authors, children's authors. I've staged competitions. I've got children reading poems on
fabulous. So the children of New Zealand have got something very exciting to look forward to. Thank you so much, Paula Green. It's been lovely to have you on the book show.
Thank you.
This week, I want to talk about 2 of my favourite crime fiction authors and their food-loving police protagonists. First, Donna Leon. She's an American writer who has lived in Venice for 25 years and where her 23 novels featuring local policeman, Commissario Guido Brunetti, are set. The second author is Malcolm Walker, a Washington-based British businessman and journalist who spent his summers in the Dordogne, where his 7 novels featuring local policeman Bruno Courrèges are set. What these 2 writers have in common, in addition to being jolly good writers in the crime fiction genre, is that their 2 cops are both passionate about food. Commissario Brunetti is a really likeable, uncomplicated family man who normally goes home for lunch, and so we get mouth-watering descriptions of food made by his wife Paola, several courses normally, and their 2 university student children are often there too. Or if he can't come home, then he maybe snacks grabbed at a bar with a glass of wine or 2, always described, or a quick sandwich during an especially busy day, or even a working lunch at a neighbourhood trattoria. For me, the food descriptions are as enjoyable as the whodunit aspects of the books. In 2010, Donna Leon teamed up with chef and her close friend to produce a beautiful hardback book published by Atlantic Monthly called Brunetti's Cookbook. In this book are many of the fabulous Venetian meals that appear in Leon's novels: eggplant crostini, orecchiette with asparagus, pumpkin ravioli, roasted artichokes, baked branzino, pork ragu with porcini, and many others. Over 90 recipes in all. The recipes are joined by excerpts from the novels, so that you get a description in the novel of stopping for lunch, and then you get the actual recipe to make that meal. There are 4 colour illustrations and 6 original essays by Donna Leon on food and life in Venice, which I found especially interesting. Martin Walker's cop, Bruno Courrèges, is also a peaceful, gentle fellow, but he likes to cook himself. He's a bachelor actually, especially for his friends in the small fictional Périgord town of Saint-Denis, where he's got thriving vegetable and herb gardens, along with his horse, ducks and hens. So Bruno cooks, he hunts, and then he cooks the spoils of his hunting. He built his own house and he grows his own food. Not exactly your average protagonist for a crime fiction series. He also maintains a sophisticated intelligence network to outwit what he regards as the interfering bureaucrats of the European Union and Brussels. The country folk of the Périgord have been making their foie gras and their cheeses and sausages for centuries before the EU was even heard of, and they see no reason to bow to their rules and regulations now. And Bruno is in total agreement. So I warmly recommend to you these two authors, Donna Leon, who's published by Heinemann, and Martin Walker, published by Quercus, along with their unusual protagonist heroes. Their books carry exceptionally good crime yarns, of course, but with these wonderful food aspects of the stories, they're perfect for the foodie crime fiction buff.
Lucky Us by Amy Bloom. It's her newest novel. Amy Bloom is a well-known American author, very highly regarded. She wrote a very famous book of short stories called Where the God of Love Hangs Out, and then a novel called Away, which I really loved, and I was thrilled to see a new one by her. There's something very special about Amy Bloom, and it's hard to describe. It's superb writing, and I think she assumes that her reader is intelligent, so she leaves a lot out and understands that we will get it. We will know what's happened in the gaps in between. This novel is based in America in the 1940s, and there are two half-sisters who are the main characters, Eva and Iris. They have the same father. Eva and her mother have lived separately, and this rather feckless father has come to visit, sometimes on a Sunday, sometimes on a Thursday, but all of Eva's life, until she's a girl of 12, he has come to visit at least once a week. Then her mother announces to her that her father's wife has died, and let's see what's in it for us. And so they get dressed up in their hats and their gloves and their best dresses, and they drive to visit the father. And that's when Eva first meets her sister Iris, her half-sister. What she doesn't realise is that her mother intends to leave her there, and in fact the mother puts a suitcase on the front porch and drives away. And Eva is left to live then with Iris and this rather feckless father who deserts them, and in the end they go to Hollywood. Iris becomes a star at Hollywood, and then there's a terrible betrayal. She's just beginning to make it as a starlet, and Eva, who's 5 years younger than her, trails around, sews sequins on her costumes and so on, and then the whole thing fails and they end up having to leave. It's full of wonderful characters. They go to New York. Iris finally goes to London, and there is no connection between them, and the only contact we have with Iris is the letters she's sending home from London, which Eva does not answer. Eva, meanwhile, has not even adopted, but taken over the care of a small boy called Danny. And Danny's one of the many wonderful characters. There's another fabulous character who was a gay man who was the makeup artist in Hollywood, who has come to live with them before Iris leaves for London, and he just becomes part of the family. So one of the things Amy Bloom does is challenges the whole notion of what a family is. This family is not blood related at all. Danny, you don't even know where Danny's come from. They've taken him from an orphanage. They've actually stolen him from an orphanage in a very funny scene. And then so this family is a family that are not even blood related, but it's about caring, it's about tenderness. There's another lovely character called Gus who ends up going back to America, and that's the other important point I want to make. Amy Bloom discovered that, in fact, during World War II, Japanese, Germans, any potentially dangerous aliens were put in camps, and some of them were given the option of going home to their homeland. Now Gus was an American, he'd never been to Germany, but he ends up going back to Germany, and again she uses this device of Gus sending letters home to Eva so we know what's going on in Germany. It's a beautiful novel. It's got some tragic things in it, but in the end it's really positive because it's tender and it's about people caring for each other. I loved it.
Paul, I reviewed your latest crime fiction novel, Fallout, on the program a couple of weeks back. This title is the fifth in your series featuring the maverick Auckland-based cop Tito Ihaka. The first one, Old School, was published way back in 1994. So in 20 years, you've given us 5 Ihaka novels, and your fans, including me, want more.
Yeah, I think I worked it out the other day that I've actually written 18 books and a screenplay and a hell of a lot of columns in those 20 years. So I kind of feel I've been reasonably productive. But, you know, the reality of being a writer in this country is that, you know, sometimes you have to take on things that aren't necessarily what you'd want to do, but just to pay the bills. So, you know, and I went away from eHaka for various reasons for a while because I didn't want to get into that treadmill of, you know, churning them out, you know, one after another and writing about a character who didn't change. And I found that break enabled me to pick him up 15 years down the road where he has undergone some changes, and that I found that interesting.
When might we expect the next one? Then are you working on the next one? Or
I am. Yeah, I'm not at the writing stage. I'm at the planning stage, but it's probably a couple of years away, realistically.
Yeah. Most of the world's major crime fiction writers have a particular cop or private eye that they feature in all their books. One thinks of Ian Rankin's John Rebus and P.D. James' Adam Dalgliesh and Sue Grafton's Kinsey Mulhone, Patricia Cornwell's Kay Scarpetta and so on. As a reader, one tends to become rather attached to these people, and we're always waiting for the next one. And I've seen your character described, and I quote here, as standing slightly apart from society and somewhat untroubled by expected scruples. Tell us about Tito Ihaka. I mean, where did you get the name from, and where did the sort of character come from? Was there a real cop who played a part, and do other fictional characters influence your...
No, I think the character came from at school. We used to have to do cadets. We had a cadet week where, you know, they'd dress us up in you know, horribly uncomfortable serge uniforms and make us march around in the 30-degree heat. And we'd get these professional soldiers from Papakura would come in. And a lot of them were Maori, and they were very formidable people. Unlike Tito, they were rangy, fit characters, but they had this air of competence and slight menace, you know, and you just thought to yourself, if I was ever in trouble, you would want a guy like that. So when I was, you know, trying to create the character of Ihaka, that came to mind, but I thought I would make him indisciplined in his lifestyle. So he had those qualities, but without the self-discipline that those soldiers had. The name came from a friend of my father's, the Ihaka, and Tito just sort of popped into my head one day when I was trying to fill in his backstory, and I thought of making his father a kind of firebrand left-wing trade unionist, but a maverick, so Tito sort of was the obvious name.
Terrific. You mentioned his change and the way you picked them up again, but because most fictional cops, and the ones I mentioned before, they tend never to change. They don't even get older. But now in this new novel, Fallout, Ihaka seems a bit more comfortable in his own skin, a bit more composed. He's still, of course, far from perfect, but is this part of the change that you've seen in him as he got older in this?
Yeah. I mean, I guess he's like most people, you know, as he gets older, he grows up a bit, and you know, perhaps he's slightly less self-absorbed or blinkered in the sense that he's aware that he's probably missed out on some of what life has to offer because of his sort of single-mindedness. And I think that's starting to eat away at him a bit.
Yes. How do you know about police procedures? Because I mean, they seem incredibly legitimate in the book. I mean, have you studied that, or have you got a friend who's a cop?
I have spoken to cops over the years, and I've, you know, researched it. I do look for stories that are kind of outside day-to-day normal police work. And I mean, to me, one of the real challenges facing crime writers now is if you are going to do a realistic novel, you have to make sure you're on top of the science, because that's really the way that crime investigation is going. I can remember talking to James Elroy, and he said one of the reasons that he sets his books in the 50s and 60s is because he doesn't have to go and understand the science. And besides, what's interesting about a guy looking through a microscope to discover who the murderer was, you know? And I think it's a real issue. Because if you're not going to do the kind of the DNA stuff and all that, then it's actually not realistic anymore.
It is pretty complicated, the whole forensic thing.
Absolutely, it is. And it takes the human element out of the crime story.
Right.
So that's the issue for the writer.
All of your E. Harker books have done well, of course, both critically and sales-wise. I mean, Inside Dope, which was the second one, won the inaugural Ned Kelly Award, which must have been a real thrill. And then the fourth in the series, Death on Demand, won you the Ngaio Marsh Award.
Yeah.
These awards mean a lot to you? And
Yeah, it's always nice. There's a line in one of my favourite lines in the movies from a film called Mad Dog and Glory, where Bill Murray says, you know, my shrink always tells me that I'm focused on recognition rather than achievement. And I think you have to not rely on other people's opinion. You know, you've got to trust your own judgment that what you're doing is worthwhile. But yes, it's obviously nice that you win the odd thing. And, but as I say, it's a very random business, really, as you know, these things.
yeah. When you started writing, because 20 years ago there was hardly any crime fiction written in New Zealand, but it's now quite a flourishing business, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I'd like to think that that you know, I played a part in reviving it. As you well know, New Zealand does have a history of crime fiction, notably Ngaio Marsh, of course. I still think that there is a bit of a cultural cringe here around crime fiction. I think it's one of the last relics of the cultural cringe, almost, that there's people still have this idea that a crime novel set overseas must be somehow better and more dramatic and darker and this, that and the next thing than local, which is unfortunate. It's just going to take time, I guess, like everything else.
I think you're helping overcome that. So.
I hope so.
Thank you very much for coming in.
That's a pleasure. Thank you, Graham.
That's the show for this week. Next week I'll be talking to Kevin Chapman of Upstart Press.
And I'll be talking to Jenna Todd from Time Out Bookstore in Mount Eden. She's recently visited the States and she'll also be reviewing a book for us. So we'll see you next week.
Happy reading meantime.